How's it going, guys? It's Noir Tapes back with another video. Today I wanted to go a bit into detail about how I like to pick samples apart and use the different elements in a sample, right? I like to find samples with bass and high end, sometimes in the middle too, and I like to separate them and create unique layers with all the individual parts. I think it's really handy when you're creating a beat. It drives creativity for one, because you can hear particular things in samples and you're like, I can just take that. And two, it's an easy way to create variation in your arrangement, right? If you're pulling the bass from a sample and then also keeping the high end and using that as an individual layer, you can easily create an A-B section, right? You know, you've got your high end playing for like your hook, and then you just take the high end away and you got your bass just playing for like a verse, right? I think it's a great skill to have, and it's pretty simple. Some of the plugins I'll be using here, you don't need to have per se. I'll tell you what type of plugin they are. I won't necessarily show you what it's doing, but I'll tell you what it's doing. And you can choose anything. You can use a stock standard Ableton plugin if you want. You can use any stock plugins at any DAW to do all these things. I just use the ones that I've got because I like them. And I like to try new things as well. So you'll see in this video. So I've got a jazz sample here. The top one is just the jazz sample by itself. And then I cut it into the high end and the low end, and I added some drums so you can get it in the context of a beat. So first I'll play the sample by itself. So it sounds a bit distant, but I think it sounds good. It loops quite nicely. It's got a bit of a jazzy, funky rhythm to it. And as you can hear, there's a pretty dominant bass line, and there's also the high end, the little piano. And so I wanted to split them and bring up the volume of both. So I wanted to get the bass, beef it up, make it sound fatter, bring it up in the mix. And then also with the high end, I wanted to create it and make it a bit more ambient and wider. And then also bring up the volume because it's quite a quiet sample. Probably due to the audio quality when it was recorded, but that's okay. So first thing I'll do is I'll show you what I did for the low end, right? So all the plugins I use on each individual layer, I just grouped them just so I can easily turn them all on and all off so you can hear the difference, right? So all I did for the bass was use an EQ to cut the highs. Pretty obvious there. You just want to keep the low end because that's where the bass is. And then I used Decapitator, but that's just saturation distortion. You can use that with any saturation distortion. Camera Crush is a good option, that's free if you want to do that. But that was just to add more high end to the bass and then also bring up the volume to make it sound fat. So I'll turn them all off and I'll go through each plugin one by one. So this is what it sounds like without any of the plugins turned on yet. And then I added the Pro Q to cut, it's just an EQ to cut the highs. And then I added the distortion / saturation. I'll play the drums here so you can hear what it sounds like in the context of the beat. Sounds pretty good, I think. So I've got the low cut out, and now it's time to cut out the highs and amplify them. So on my high end chain, I've got 2 EQs. This one's a special one. I'll tell you a bit about Peel in a second. And then this is a flanger, just a fancy flanger. So first I'll go one by one and just turn them on so you can hear what they're doing, and I'll explain the process in a minute. So firstly, I use Peel. I like using Peel sometimes. It's a really interesting EQ actually. It classifies as an EQ, but essentially you have the frequency from the lows to the highs, and then you actually have the channels from left to right as well on it. And so you can draw a box to isolate sounds anywhere in the stereo space essentially. So if I get rid of this, you'll see the whole sample here. As I was saying, the way the sample was recorded, it's quite dulled in the mix and very compressed. So I can just draw a box to get that high end that I wanted. So So all that was doing essentially is just cutting out the middle section. You can do this with any EQ as well. I just like using PL sometimes because it makes me feel cool. It's a very interesting plugin. It's very unique. Not many plugins like it. So, but you could have just used an EQ, just brought in the highs and the lows, use a bandpass essentially, and just cut out that middle section if you wanted. And then I used another EQ. This one was just to boost some of the particular sound that I wanted and remove some of the bass tones that are still in it. And the last plugin I used here is made by the same company that makes Decimort. It's a flanger, but that's what it says it is. It also adds bit crushing and sounds fancy. It's just a fancy plugin, but essentially I want to use a flanger to create some stereo because I think the actual sample is in mono. It's quite thin, or it's very thin in the stereo width anyways. So I wanted to create some stereo to it, and I like this plugin as well because it adds a bit of bit crushing, and I love that bit crushing vintage sound. This is what that does. And so now I've successfully isolated the highs. I'll turn it on and off so you can hear the difference here. And now if I add the bass back and add the drums, you can hear how it could create a bit of a hook section in a beat. So there you go, that's some of the ways you can successfully isolate the highs and the lows of a sample. These techniques are just handy to know regardless. If you hear something in a sample you like, it's important to know how to isolate that particular part and turn it into a completely new sound, essentially. So make sure you learn some of these techniques. EQ is your best friend when it comes to this stuff, and knowing some of the basic principles about how you want to shape the sound, whether it's taking the high end and expanding it. You might be taking the high end and just using the one note and creating a new instrument using one shots, right? And if you take the bass, you want to know that you're going to boost it up, or are you just using one bass note and looping a part of it and creating a new bass line, you know? I explained this a bit in the low pass technique video I created the other week. I'll link that up in the corner here. I didn't actually show you in that video how to loop it though, so I probably need to do another video explaining that. But essentially I explained how I can take one bass note from a sample and create a whole bass line. You can do the same thing here. You can take this first note of the bass, right? And you could just loop part of it and create a bass line if you wanted. You know, it's very creative sampling, and I think that's the way you got to do it these days. Looping samples can cause copyright issues, you know, and it's important to know how to sample creatively but also effectively, right? So you avoid copyright and you get props, honestly. And when you sample creatively, if they ever break it down, you know, people will be looking at it and they're like, how did he think of that? It's just good to know, good techniques to know. Anyways, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.